So with all that, budget deficits, trade deficits, high debt to GDP ratios, out of control spending, et cetera, why is the dollar strong? People are like, well, hey, people should be getting out of the dollar. It looks like the end of the world. Well, it's not. And here's why. Because there's a dollar shortage around the world. And people say, how can that be? The Fed printed, $7 trillion of money, M0 actually higher than that. I think went up to 9 trillion. They just flooded the zone with money. And the answer is yes and no. Yes, they did print, over $7 trillion of base money, so-called M0. But that money didn't go anywhere.
Around the world, countries that rely on food imports are grappling with a destructive combination of high interest rates, a soaring dollar, and elevated commodity prices, eroding their power to pay for goods that are typically priced in the greenback. Dwindling foreign currency reserves in many cases have reduced access to dollars, and banks are slow in releasing payments. The national debt has surged in recent years, driven by trillions of dollars in deficit-financed spending in response to the coronavirus pandemic, as well as new spending programs and the 2017 Republican tax cuts. There was a $2 trillion relief bill in May-June 2020, another $1 trillion deficit at the end of Trump's tenure. A decade ago, the debt totaled $16.2 trillion. 5 years ago, it was $20.3 trillion. The Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, a nonprofit that advocates for deficit reduction, said Congress and President Joe Biden have signed off on $1.9 trillion in new borrowing this year, and Biden has approved $4.9 trillion in new deficits since taking office. We had an American Recovery Act in February 2021 of about $2 trillion, an infrastructure bill of another $1 trillion, and an Inflation Reduction Act, which was about another $1 trillion. Recently, $300 billion of student loans were forgiven, and that goes into the debt deficit. Even more troubling than where the debt stands now is where it's going. Our nation faces significant fiscal challenges in the near term. Medicare is only 6 years from insolvency, and Social Security insolvency is only 12 years away. Yet policymakers have put forth no plan to put either program on strong fiscal footing. Jim Rickard, an author and investor, goes into the nitty-gritty of the U.S. debt deficit. He also explores the world of the dollar and how, amidst so much printing of money by the Fed, there is still a global shortage of the dollar and how it affects to the global economy and developing markets.
It relates to the dollar. People say, well, okay, we have massive budget deficits. We have for a while, but they're now multiple trillions of dollars per year. The baseline deficit going into the Biden administration was $1 trillion a year. When I say baseline, it's like that's what the deficit would be if you didn't do anything. You just kept all programs going and taxes about the same. But they piled on, actually going back to Trump in the pandemic, there was a $2 trillion relief bill in May, June 2020. There was another approximately $1 trillion relief bill at the end of Trump's term in December 2020. Biden comes in, he's like, well, I can top that. Trump had his relief bill, I'll have mine. And we had the American Recovery Act, or whatever they called it, in February of 2021. That was about another $2 trillion on top of that. Then we had the infrastructure bill that was just under $1 trillion. Now we have they stopped calling it Build Back Better. That was the worst marketing campaign in history. But the Inflation Reduction Act, which will actually increase inflation, but that's about another $1 trillion. And we just had $300 billion of student loan forgiveness. Sounds like peace, love, and understanding, except the taxpayers have to pay that. When you forgive the student loans, it goes into the budget deficit. People don't understand the accounting, but that's how it works. You don't have a deficit when you make the loan. It's carried on the books as an asset. But if you forgive the loan, you have to write it off. And then that does hit the deficit at that time. So we're talking about, at this point, $5 or $6 trillion on top of the $1 trillion baseline deficit. The US GDP debt to GDP ratio is up around 130%, going higher. And if you said, hey, look around the world, who's at that lunch table? Like who else has like 130% debt to GDP ratio? The answer is Lebanon, Greece, and Italy. So that's your lunch table. This is the peer group that the United States is in. Not counting Japan. Japan's in a world of its own, but they're much higher. But that's what the modern monetary theorists say. Hey, look at Japan. They're 300%. We could triple the debt, and it's all good. That's not correct, but that is what they say, and Congress is acting that way. So with all that, budget deficits, trade deficits, high debt to GDP ratios, out of control spending, et cetera, why is the dollar strong? People are like, well, hey, people should be getting out of the dollar. It looks like the end of the world. Well, it's not. And here's why. Because there's a dollar shortage around the world. And people say, how can that be? You know, the Fed printed, $7 trillion of money, M0, actually higher than that. I think it went up to 9 trillion. They just flooded the zone with money. And the answer is yes and no. Yes, they did print, over $7 trillion of base money, so-called M0. But that money didn't go anywhere. The Fed, how does the Fed print money? Well, they buy bonds from dealers, from the big banks, the so-called primary dealers. So the open market desk at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York calls up Goldman Sachs, they offer me 10-year notes. Goldman says, here's a price. Okay, done. Goldman delivers the notes to the Treasury, to the Fed, and the Fed pays Goldman. And that money comes out of thin air. That is money printing. But then Goldman takes the money and gives it back to the Fed as excess reserves. It doesn't go into the real economy. Nobody borrows it, nobody spends it, nobody lends it. All that happens is at the Fed, you're building up both sides of the balance sheet. You're building up the asset side with US Treasury securities, and you're building up the liability side with deposits from the primary dealers in the form of excess reserves.
Even if it were politically possible, would pile on even more debt and could rattle investors wary of policies that could stoke higher prices. That's a lesson that outgoing British Prime Minister Liz Truss learned the hard way. According to Jim Rickards, inflation usually comes from the supply side, oil supply chain disruptions, wheat, etc., and is intensified by certain fiscal policies because the money exists and doesn't do anything. He also pointed out that the payroll protection by Trump helped prevent the economy from totally going underwater, but it wasn't needed in January of this year, and that was what happened in the Biden administration and fueled the inflation more.
So that money doesn't do anything. I mean, it's printed, if you want to say that, but it has not caused inflation. The inflation comes from, as I discussed earlier, from the supply side. The price of oil, supply chain disruptions, wheat, food, gasoline, et cetera. The inflation is flooding in, and it's exacerbated by fiscal policy. Now you have to, what I just described about the money printing, that's monetary policy. Okay. But fiscal policy, which is the 5 or 6 or probably $7 trillion of deficit spending, that's helicopter money. When the federal government and the Congress and the Treasury hand out checks, that's helicopter money. That's not like giving Goldman money and then Goldman gives it back to you. Forget that. It doesn't do anything. I mean, it exists. It doesn't do anything. But when the government hands out checks, that's real. Now, some people saved them during the pandemic. A lot of millennials opened accounts on Robinhood and started trading cryptos. They could, kiss that money goodbye. But more recently, that money has been spent, and particularly the Biden bill. I don't want to single out Biden for political reasons, but what Trump did in 2020 probably needed some of that. The payroll protection or the paycheck protection plan, that was almost $1 trillion. That really did keep the economy from completely going down the chute. But we didn't need that in January or February 2021. And Larry Summers, to his credit, said so. He said, hey, we've had enough stimulus. We're growing. Let's not throw more money out of the helicopter. But they did. And that's when the inflation really took off. So that was driven not by monetary policy. It was driven by fiscal policy. But getting back to the strong dollar, there's something else going on, which is the entire international monetary system is driven not by the Fed, but by Eurodollars, by money that banks lend to each other so that they can support their balance sheets and lend to customers or offer transactions to customers if they will. And the main transactions, the 800-pound gorilla, if you will, is approximately $1 quadrillion of derivatives. That's what's happening. So how do I get a bill if I'm Deutsche Bank or Credit Suisse or UBS or Unicredit or Barclays or anybody else? I need dollars. Because the bills are denominated in dollars. So if I want to buy them, I got to get some dollars. So there's this huge bid for dollars that can be used to buy the treasury securities, to pledge as collateral, to prop up the balance sheet. And that's what's going on behind the curtain. That's the plumbing. That's why the dollar is strong, even though everything about the US economy is weak, meaning recession, long-term depression, deficits, trade deficits, political dysfunction, borderline civil war. It's all bad. But if I'm Deutsche Bank, I need those dollars to buy treasury bills to prop up my balance sheet.
In a conclusion, tightening monetary policies, inflation, and recession is not only driven by the Fed, but by the interaction between the big banks, lending and borrowing money from each other, the eurodollars, and transactions going on between banks and customers. There is a huge bid for dollars because most securities and treasuries are dollar-dominated, and you need to have dollars to purchase them, and that is what's going on with the dollar while it remains strong irrespective of the weak U.S. economy. The dollar has strengthened sharply compared to the currencies of many industrialized nations and emerging markets to reach a 20-year high. This appreciation of the dollar is viewed as a major global challenge for most countries, especially emerging market economies. In the past, many countries would have embraced a strong dollar. Indeed, emerging market countries like China often intervened in foreign exchange markets in the hopes of weakening the value of their currencies to gain a trade advantage. But today, both advanced and emerging countries alike are struggling against further depreciation of their currencies for a range of reasons. How does the strong dollar affect your local currency? We would like to know your experiences in the comment section. Don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications.